Keith Windschuttle's 2002 book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, is a big book in several ways. It's altered the widely held view that early white settlers of Tasmania committed genocide on the Indigenous people. Yet it's unusual that the book was actually ever written. Windschuttle did it on his own time and with his own money, and for his troubles, he's received quite a bit of abuse. And that's why we're returning to the book today, to remind ourselves what can happen to an original thinker in the humanities and reflect maybe on the sort of message that the treatment of him must have sent to young scholars. Keith Windschuttle, welcome back to Counterpoint.
Thank you.
Now, you've got an article in the latest issue of Quadrant magazine saying that some of the criticism of your book was postmodernist. Can you give us some examples?
Well, the main one is that historical realism, the sort of perspective that I follow, that you investigate your facts and then you deduce your conclusions from the facts, that's kind of passé, and that instead of documentary evidence, we can now use Aboriginal myths and legends, such as the one that Captain Cook founded Sydney, even though he died a decade before the first fleet arrived. He also founded Darwin. He massacred lots of Aborigines right around the country, according to these Aboriginal myths. And we've now got historians, the one I'm talking about who argues this case is Bain Attwood from Monash University, who argues that these particular ideas should be regarded as kind of symbolic of Aboriginal and white relations, and therefore they are the authentic voice of history. I'm quoting his own words there. And it seems to me this gives the whole game of history away, because people can make up myths, they can massage the truth in any way you like in myths and legends, and there's no checks on its veracity. There's no way you can have a dispute over myths. You can't prove one is right and one is wrong, or you can't dispute the details in them. It just means that you give history away completely.
I know there must be a bit of that happening, but what about the proportions? I mean, do most historians think like that?
No, I think, in fact, postmodernism is going out of fashion, and if you look at the sort of press in the past week with the Prime Minister and figures on the left like David Williamson coming out denouncing it pretty strongly, postmodernism is a pretty hard barrier to push uphill these days. I mean, I think what Attwood's book is the last of the last gasp of postmodernism, if you like.
This is a book by Bain Attwood.
That's right, called "Telling the Truth About Aboriginal History," and that's probably the main target of my article. But I'm also arguing that that postmodernism, because it involves a suspension of evidence of the general criteria of how you prove cases in history, that no dispute can ever be resolved, and so therefore disputes between postmodernist historians and others come down to a matter of trying to analyse people's political views, their psychological state. In other words, just it comes down to calling each other names. And if you actually look at some of the names that I've been called, I sort of drew them all together from my files, and even I was surprised to find just the extent of the ad hominem abuse that's gone on in this whole debate.
We might go into that in a second, but let's just talk about some of the more substantial things for now. I'm particularly interested in the varying use of the word genocide, which I guess, and the Holocaust, which to most people would evoke memories of Nazi Germany or whatever. But obviously there are many different ways it's now used by academics. Is that fair enough that you've run into some confusion over the use of that word?
Well, not only genocide, but also the word Holocaust. I mean, up until recently, anyone who uses the word Holocaust in a historical context is either talking directly about what happened to the Jews in Germany, or else is making a comparison with it. And that's common usage. You can't go around changing common usage. That's what people think when they hear the word Holocaust. But now we've had two historians, Bain Attwood's one and Dirk Moses in the newspaper the other day. In fact, in response to an article by you, Dirk Moses was talking about big H Holocaust and small h Holocaust, that if you use the word Holocaust, you're not necessarily making comparisons with what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s. You can have a homegrown version of Holocaust which doesn't mean that and doesn't, according to him, relate that. But I mean, I think that's playing with words. I think it's changing not only the common usage of it, but it's fudging the argument to a ridiculous extent.
It was also argued, wasn't it, that historians had never actually used such terms in relation to the early history of Tasmania, and that it was just journalists and other reckless people who'd actually misinterpreted what the historians had said.
Well, that's right. I mean, one of the messes that the historians who have been criticising me have got themselves into is that they've wanted to say that I'm exaggerating their claims of genocide, and some of them, Moses, has said that no historian in Australia ever uses the term Holocaust, and I found, plenty of people who do, including people he's defended. He's claimed haven't used the case. There are people who, Cassandra Pybus from the University of Tasmania says she doesn't want to call what happened in Tasmania genocide. She said that on one Channel 9 program a few months before on Four Corners. She said what happened in Tasmania was genocide and one of the most clearest cases of it we have. Now, people in trying to shift the goalposts in their arguments to deflect criticism largely from me have ended up contradicting themselves, and you have to wonder whether they got short memories or whether they're actually capable of telling that they have contradicted themselves. And that's when you get this kind of capital G and small g genocide and capital H and small h Holocaust kind of arguments, when they say, oh, we didn't mean that genocide, we meant this kind of genocide. And quite frankly, it's left my critics, I think, in a pretty, publicly embarrassing way.
Yeah, I find the whole thing extraordinary because I was taught by university lecturers back in the 1970s. That Australia was compared to Nazi Germany, and those words were used often in public debate for 20 or 30 years, and now all of a sudden people are trying to walk away from it. Moving on, though, your book provoked another book. I think it was called Whitewash, which was attacking you, wasn't it? Written by a group of historians.
That's right. Robert Mann edited it, and the people I attacked largely came back and had a go at me in that.
And, of course, Geoffrey Blaney experienced a similar thing back in the 1980s, this sort of group attack. Where do you think your book stands now? Did they manage to find many factual errors in it?
Well, I don't think they found any. There's one, I have a tally of the number of Tasmanians of whom the Tasmanian Aborigines whom the credible evidence shows were killed by white settlers. And thanks to my critics, I've had to increase the tally from 120 to 121. There's one book that I hadn't read, The Diary of a Surveyor, and in it he had one case where he thought an Aboriginal woman had been shot and killed. And I'd missed that, so I put it in. So, in fact, what the attacks on my book have done have really confirmed that there's no credible evidence that there's large-scale killings of Aborigines in Tasmania by whites. What the people who are criticising me are left to fall back on is the idea that there must have been lots of unrecorded killings on the frontier, and that's just speculation. Maybe there were some unrecorded killings on the frontier, but historians have to have evidence for their claims. You can't just sort of say, well, we think it happened, we've got no good reason to believe it, but it's a desirable conclusion, therefore it becomes true. Then you degenerate into the whole postmodernist worldview that people can decide the truth among themselves. A collective of historians who want to agree on a particular point, come to a consensus, and therefore that is the truth. Well, that's not the truth. The truth is what the evidence shows. You're
listening to Counterpoint on ABC's Radio National, where our guest is Keith Windschuttle, and we're talking about the critical response to his book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, Volume 1. So, Keith, let's talk about some of the ad hominem attacks on you. You've been accused, for example, of suffering from castration anxiety, haven't you? Do you?
Well, it's news to me if I do. The idea that I'm fearful for my genitals, and that's why I've criticising these historians.
This was in an academic journal, by the way, wasn't it?
Oh, that's right, in the journal Aboriginal History, and it tells you not only about the sort of quality of the person who made that claim, Dirk Moses, the University of Sydney History Department, but also the editors. That issue was edited by Anne Curtis and John Docker, and they must have thought that was okay to say. The anonymous referees who presumably went through the thing, they didn't say pull this out. And also, the whole board, there's 20-something people on the board, and none of them have complained about it. I think that sort of comment is so bizarre, because nobody on my side of the fence, and I wasn't the only one who was criticising this, there were three other people, Ron Brunton and Hugh Morgan were also...
Patrick Morgan?
Well, sorry.
It's Hugh Morgan, was it?
I thought it was Hugh Morgan. He just says Brunton, Morgan and Windschuttle. But anyway, whichever Morgan it is, the idea that, we're fearful for our genitals is is really, it's obviously below the belt, weak pun, but nobody's ever stooped to that kind of comment in any historical debate in Australia that I'm aware of. And the interesting thing about it is that the academic infrastructure behind that particular comment, the editors of the journal, the board of the journal, none of them have thought there's anything wrong with it at all.
We've only got a bit of time left. I just want to cover a few quick points. Is it true that one academic used 2 research assistants to investigate your past?
Oh, that's right. I mean, Bain Attwood wanted to put the argument that I'm a sort of crazy extremist in my student days when I was a leftist. He tried to find me making a whole lot of wild claims and employed 2 research assistants to go through ASIO files in the National Archives. Unfortunately for him, there's no dedicated file on me either in ASIO files or in Special Branch. I mean, I've applied for those myself and been told there's nothing on you. Nonetheless, he managed to find a couple of comments that ASIO agents heard me making at anti-Vietnam meetings and although what he reports, I actually don't believe, because he talks about one case, an anti-war centre in Sydney where I'm supposed to have spoken, and I don't recall anything of that name. I think these reports themselves are pretty dubious, despite all the money that's gone into pulling them out.
I understand you've also been called things like a fanatical communist, a Pol Pot enthusiast, and we won't go into those, we don't have time. But just, can I ask you a last question? What do the leaders of the history profession do? The deans, the professors? You've talked a bit about the members of editorial boards. Did any of them praise your book, or at least suggest publicly that some of the criticism has been a bit over the top?
None of them have praised the book. Stuart McIntyre, who's the sort of godfather of Australian history, the Dean of Melbourne History School, he said, I'm persuaded that some of Windschuttle's charges are true. He's never said which charges. And of course, if some of them are true, then the logical thing is to ask is what interpretation should be changed if some of the charges I've made are true. And neither McIntyre nor anyone else has suggested that as well. So the history profession has really kind of closed ranks and is not accepting the sort of charges I've made,
All right.
even though they can't refute them.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, Keith. Thanks for coming on the program. Keith Windschuttle is the author of The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, Volume 1, and he's written an article in the latest issue of Quadrant magazine about the critical response he's received.